There's a lot of myths around trauma and that sort of thing as well. And it's like, everybody has trauma, everybody. And so the idea that trauma creates addiction, it's like, well, then everybody should be an addict. And that's just not true. It certainly contributes. But so what I try to do is demystify addiction, demystify codependency, and give people a plan to follow.
Welcome to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. This episode is sponsored by the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. Hi, I'm Janine Wolf, and I'm your colleague down the hall. I have a passion for helping fellow therapists get the clinical and collegial support we all need to do this work. And wow, it just keeps getting harder every day. I'm the founder and facilitator of the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. I have been a social worker for almost 30 years, and I own a successful solo online private practice. More of us than ever are practicing in solo or online practices, and we all need colleagues to process cases with, commiserate with on those really hard days, and also to celebrate our successes with. In this podcast, I'll bring you insights about trends and changes in our field and sit down with amazing therapists who are doing amazing work. We'll discuss fictionalized cases, ways to practice sustainably, and of course, there will be plenty of laughing. I love laughing with friends. I'm so glad to have you as one of my colleagues down the hall. Hello, everyone. You are listening to another episode of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. I'm your host, Janine Wolf, joined today by Kevin Petersen. Kevin is the founder of the Chronic Hope Institute, which provides healing for families in crisis due to addiction and codependency and family addiction coaching training for clinicians. Today, we're going to talk about working with families that are struggling with addiction from the family systems perspective, which when you think about it, it's got to be the only way that you're going to make this work with this population. So welcome, Kevin.
Hey, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. And oh my God, I'm so excited to talk about this.
Therapists are so passionate, and I always love having someone on that, like, I can see the passion right from the start. And that's great. I'm totally getting those vibes from you. So I'm so happy to have you here. So most of us have only had brief training with working in the realm of addiction. In graduate school, maybe we had one course a long, long time ago. We feel insecure about working with those people. So we don't necessarily know how to support not only the person who is dealing with addiction, but obviously the families as well. So tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, in order to answer that question, I got to back up a little bit. I grew up in Palo Alto, California, which I'm 59. I'm going to be 60 next year.
My husband just turned 60 and I'm right behind him. So I'm feeling that.
How did that happen? Right. When I grew up there, it was a small college town, basically attached to Stanford. And people, it was like, who, where, what, who? But I grew up in a really nice home. My dad was very successful, but we had a big family secret. And my family secret was my mom was a prescription drug addict and had a lot of mental health issues. And so as kids, we learned to adapt and to accommodate her. And I love my mom. My mom passed away in 2014. I love my mother. I love my father. He passed away 2 years ago. That's just my reality, and
right.
So I grew up in that household where, we at a very early age had to learn how to survive. And on the outside, it was this $2 million home with BMWs and trips to Hawaii and on the inside, it was every man for himself, which is most families that struggle with addiction and mental health. And then about 13, 14, I started drinking and smoking pot. And I did fairly okay with it through high school. I was an athlete. And when I went to college in 1982, that's when the wheels came off, and things really went south for me there. Blah, 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 blah. 6 years into college, my parents were like, so when are you going to graduate? And I'm like, that's a good question. And I turned in the paperwork to you. I was at USC in Los Angeles. And what I got back was this handwritten note saying, what are you kidding? You're not even enrolled at the school. You're not going to graduate, and you have a 1.1 GPA. You owe us $10,000. You're on every level of probation that exists. I read that and I'm like, oh, I'm graduating in May. And it's funny now.
Yeah.
Rented the cap and gown and bought the announcements and had my family fly in and faked my graduation in May of 1988. That worked for a couple of years. And then in 1990 at a family reunion, my dad and I, he's like, let's drive home together. It was like a 4-hour drive. And the first 5 minutes went like this: "You're my only son and I love you, but I don't believe a word out of your mouth. You're a liar, a cheat, and a thief, drug addict, alcoholic. Until those things change, we're going to keep you at a distance." And I'd heard this before. And I thought, oh, we're going to do this again. This time they stuck to their guns, which helped me get sober in May of 1991. I've been sober since May 5th, 1991. I swear to God,
Congratulations.
I'm going to answer the question. I swear to God.
No, this is fascinating. I think the backstory is really important in this type of work.
Okay. So, and I've been continuously sober through the 12-step world since then. In 2000, I got married. I moved to Denver in 1995. I got married in 2002. I got divorced in 2005. And in 2008, I went back to graduate school at a little school in Denver, a little Jesuit school in Denver called Regis. The year I was there, they opened up a marriage and family program. And I took the first class in the theories, and family systems was just like, oh,
yeah,
this makes sense.
Right. Yeah.
So I was part of the first class that graduated from that program in 2011. And then I worked 3 years in community mental health. In 2014, I opened up a private practice, swearing to God I would never work with addicts and alcoholics and their families. Those people are crazy.
Famous last words.
And that's all I do. That's all I do. And I've written a couple books. I've designed family programs, intensives. My strength is that I grew up in that household. I became the problem. I became the solution. And then I became a mental health professional. Mm-hmm. So I can help the clients. And now, just this week, I have released a training, an online training for therapists based upon my professional and personal experience on how to work with families that are struggling with addiction. Because like you said, I mean, honestly, we all got one class, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then we got 0 classes on families and addiction,
Right.
And so there, I've landed the plane.
Okay. And like so many of us, our lives were on the job training. We go into populations of people that mirror our own life experience. With my ADHD brain, that's who are drawn to me. I work with a lot of women with ADHD, and I think we hear these types of stories in our field all the time.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, when I opened up my private practice, I was still working in community mental health in Denver. And I was doing 1 day a week, and I was like, oh God, please no. And I mean, there was a line at the door, I mean, just like, hi, because Colorado at that in 2014 had decided to legalize recreational marijuana. And I had parents at the door with like, my 16-year-old is stoned 24/7 and I don't know what to do. And I don't know. I mean, and I'm like, I do. And it's not. So part of my whole thing is that I created a whole system really based upon what my parents did with me. They were like, we love you, but, you got to get sober and we'll help you. But if you choose to continue down your party lifestyle, then you're choosing out of the family.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a tough love situation where they slammed the door in my face.
Okay.
Like, never talk to us again. They were like,
I think that's what most of us are familiar with, because we see that in celebrities and stuff, the tough love stance.
And it doesn't work. It just doesn't.
Okay.
They said, we love you. And, we'll let you know when you can come over. But when you come over, you got to be sober. And if you're not, we'll ask you to leave,
Mm-hmm.
But if you want help, we will move heaven and earth for you. And so what I've designed is in the books that I wrote, what I've designed is a plan. And it's a plan of setting boundaries in 3 categories: drugs and alcohol, school or work, and family behavior. And everyone's like, oh, we set boundaries. I'm like, right. And then what did you do when the boundaries weren't met? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, right. That's kind of the difference maker for me, is that there's accountability and then there's rewards and consequences. And I love teaching other therapists how to do this, because generally what they come from is a perspective of, they took 1 class or none, or they've done the DSM, or they don't really understand anything about recovery, and then there's a lot of myths around trauma and that sort of thing as well. And it's like, everybody has trauma, everybody. And so the idea that trauma creates addiction, it's like, well, then everybody should be an addict. And that's just not true. It certainly contributes, but so what I try to do is demystify addiction, demystify codependency and give people a plan to follow.
That's great. Yeah. And so as you were speaking, I'm thinking, okay, so I imagine part of this is retraining family members about the codependency that they have been unaware that they've learned and mastered. And now they have to figure out a new way of doing that. Is that pretty much the starting point when working with families? Or is there some other place you start?
It really depends. The first phone call tends to be, oh shit, my husband, my wife, my father, my mother, my sister, my brother, my child is chaotic and crisis, and we don't know what to do. I have a plan for that. I call that triaging the crisis. It's the classic stance, right, of the therapist, where what I always tell people, it's like, well, it's like you come home and you see your house is on fire and the fire department's there and they got everything ready, but they're not putting any water on your house. And you're like, dude, what's going on? And that's what it's got. The classic therapy stance is, so how does this make you feel to watch your house burn down? Or, is this something that's happened before? Does this make you uncomfortable? What sort of emotions are you feeling? It's like, put the goddamn fire out, and
right. Yeah.
So what I do really is, we're going to put that damn fire out right now. We're going to have a set plan. It's going to be very clear. It's going to be very concise. And we're going to do plan A. And if plan A doesn't work, we're going to do plan B. Let's be clear. If somebody has a needle in their arm or popping fentanyls, it's like, we're going to go straight to intervention. I outline how to pick a treatment center, I have all that. Okay. So that's the initial, oh shit,
right.
The house is on fire. Let's put the fire out. So once that's resolved, which actually is pretty straightforward and pretty easy, then it's, oh, hey, now that we've got so-and-so in treatment, now it's time to talk about the family, and now it's digging into, you can't really walk in and just start calling people codependent because they get,
yeah.
I mean, I've tried that. It doesn't work.
Yeah. They get really defensive, I would imagine.
I'm like, well, yeah. And, I think one of the things I try to do is really educate the heck out of them. So a lot of psychoeducation in my books, in Melody Beattie's books, in Pia Melody's books. There's a plethora. There's some great documentaries. So I have a whole lineup of stuff that I have people educate on. And what happens from that process, right, is they start reading this stuff and they're like, oh yeah, I did that. Oh yeah, no, I do that. Oh no, that's our system. No. So without me finger pointing, they come to the table and they're like, so I identified with this, and I'm like, yeah, that's okay. That's great. That's and the thing is, most families come from this perspective of, what did we do wrong?
Yeah.
I'm like, you didn't do anything wrong. The truth of the matter is, it's probably genetic, and there's probably it's nature. There's probably a little bit of nurture, and there's probably some trauma stuff too. So, and it's nothing you could have, unless you were going to follow them around 24/7, which, by the way, we're going to stop doing.
Okay. Yeah.
and that hovering thing, that has to go, because the next thing they say is, he's 28 years old and he acts like a 5-year-old, and he can't do his own laundry, he doesn't cook. I'm like, well, why should he? You do it all for him. You can't get mad at him for not doing things that you're doing for him. And when they start to see that, I'm like, so let's be clear, and this is one of my catchphrases.
Okay.
It's one of my many, is that you can't expect them to do something you're not willing to do. So if we want the addict or even severe mental health person to get help and get into recovery, you have to do the same thing. So you have to change the way you're engaging with them. And that's going to be the number one thing that'll actually help them get to their own recovery, is when the family system changes. And I'm not talking about coming in with a big stick and finger pointing. I'm talking about, oh, hey, we love you. We're just not going to do that anymore.
Right. Forgive me, but I'm going to go on a little tangent here, because this podcast is for therapists. One of the things that comes up periodically in the consultation groups that I facilitate is, okay, so I have this client and they've been seeing me for depression. They have a substance abuse issue. It seems to be escalating. I've told them that I don't specialize in that. I can continue treating the depression, but they're going to also need substance abuse treatment. And they're delaying and pausing and putting it off. And I don't know what to do, because if I discharge them, they're not going to get help from anybody. But if I keep working with them, they're still not going to get help from anybody. What do I do?
Oh my,
And I know that's tricky. And the co-occurring, and this came up recently, and I said, there's been a debate, as far as I know, for many, many years about which do you treat first. So I think this is probably falling in that realm a little.
Oh yeah, no, I get this every day, and I'll tell you my opinion.
Okay,
It's
I'd love to hear your
solely
opinion.
my opinion. Okay?
Absolutely, yeah.
You can't treat mental health issues if they're actively struggling with substance abuse because you're not getting the real person. You have to get them sober first.
So if they come in with depression and you're treating that, and then they start to develop this substance abuse issue, does that change your perspective on that at all?
No, because to be totally blunt, I don't look at it from the DSM perspective. Okay. I look at it as addiction and alcoholism are like being pregnant. You either is or you isn't.
Okay.
It doesn't go away. Okay. And you don't pick it up in a public restroom. It's not something you get from that bad girlfriend or that bad boyfriend. You either is or you isn't. You either don't have a filter and don't have the ability to, by the way, all of this is covered in my training and in my books.
Of course, yeah.
and this is where I differ. And this is where I'm coming at it from a perspective of, let me explain to you my perspective as a recovering addict and recovering alcoholic on how we see things.
Okay.
Because this is a great question, by the way. Most clinicians come at it from the perspective, well, I'm in the DSM and there's 5 different categories. And, the truth is we don't see it that way. We see it as one or the other. You're either one of us or you're not. You either have the ability to control your drugs and alcohol or you don't. You can actually be the kind of person that, might get a little over the edge and then gets pulled back by some legal issues, or your boss is like, hey, knock this crap off or you're fired, or your spouse is like, knock this shit off or you're out, and you're like, oh, goddamn. And I got to knock this off. Addicts and alcoholics can't do that.
Right.
But again, the system that I've created, back to your question of what does the clinician do? So what I would say for the clinician is, okay, well, you need to sit down with your client, and you may risk losing the client. But the truth of the matter is, if you're seeing someone continuously and they're using, you're not helping them. So you're just not, and like my wife will tell you that, she saw in Denver, in Colorado, she saw what was renowned as the best trauma therapist in Colorado. And at no point was told that she needed to stop drinking. So
my gosh. Wow.
She would go, she'll go do this heavy duty EMDR stuff and go home and drink a couple bottles of wine. And she was like, I don't understand why this isn't working, and so, our perspective is you have to clean up, or at least put the whole substance abuse stuff on pause. Now, what that means is, so if I've seen a client and the client's like, hey, I'm struggling with all this stuff. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I think it's probably a good idea if you stop using. And they're like, no, or I refuse to. That's a huge sign.
Okay.
It's like people that don't have a problem with alcohol and drugs are like, oh, my therapist says I need to quit drinking for 30 days and see how it affects my life. That sounds like a good idea. Or this is going to be a pain in the butt, but I'll do it anyway. Addicts and alcoholics are like, this is bullshit. I don't have a problem. And it's like, So I try to make things really black and white. Really, am I answering your question?
You are. And, and I think the root of this particular issue, and multiple issues actually in our field, is that most of us are not adequately trained about referring out. And we're so afraid of being charged with client abandonment that we're like, I have to keep working with this person because they're not going to see anybody. And so we're so terrified of getting in trouble that we don't know that there are ethical and professional ways to refer out. And if you do it correctly, you're going to be okay. But we're terrified we're not going to do it correctly.
Absolutely. Because again, let's go back to graduate school. And where'd you go to graduate school?
In Virginia, Norfolk State University.
Great school, and I went to a great school in Denver, Regis. How many classes in substance abuse did you take?
I actually had 0. It was an elective, and I was working in pediatric hospice at the time, and so I went more towards the medical model. So I took a different elective. So I had no training whatsoever.
And I, only because I joined the LMFT program, had one. And the funny part was the teacher, who was great guy, loved him to death. He knew at that point I was like 20 years sober. So he was just like, I'm going to lecture on the material and then we're going to talk to Kevin. And
Yeah.
and I was like, the material's great. And there certainly are, let's be clear, there are many other options other than this 12-step community. And that's totally cool. You can go to church, you can go to therapy, but there's two conditions. One, you got to get abstinent, whatever it is. Two, your behavior has to change. And if those two things happen in whatever system you choose, hallelujah, that's great. I couldn't be any happier. The one that works for me is the 12-step community, but doesn't work for everybody,
Right.
and I talk a lot about what the myths are about that, and
Okay.
but it's sad because let's be totally blunt. How often does some sort of substance abuse system walk into your office? It's every day. It's every single day, whether it's the individual, their family of origin, their generational system, and it's part of the day-to-day existence of our community and our society. And we really don't do a very good job of educating ourselves. And so that's kind of where I was coming from. And like, you know what?
Yeah.
I'd like to throw this out there and let people understand, hey, there's another way of looking at this. And one of the things I hear from therapists all the time is, God, I've been working with this guy for a year and a half and he just can't get sober. And I'm like, well, okay, let's talk about that. What have you tried? And they'll call me for consultation. I had one therapist who I love and adore, a great friend of mine. She's like, Kevin, I got to tell you, this client and I, we've been trying so hard. We just can't seem to keep him sober. I'm like, I want you to listen to the phrase that you just said to me. And she was like,
never work harder than your client.
Anytime you're using the words we, I think we need to have a little chat, because the truth of the matter is, no, there isn't a therapist on the planet that can get somebody sober. That's not how it works. That's not our job. Our job is to deal with the emotions and the feelings and the stuff that comes when they're sober, and so let's use the tools at our feet and be able to say, hey, I think let's just try, hey, for the next month, let's try no drinking, no drugs, and we'll be on the honor system and we'll see how it goes, and then we can walk through it and start seeing how that works. Oh, it didn't work. Okay, well then let's try a little. Let's move it up. Let's move it up. And that tends to be the system where it's not so threatening and it's not so, you're not labeling and you're not slapping people around. You're just like, hey, it's okay. If this is your reality, great. It's like you said, ADD, ADHD. Oh, okay, great. Let's do some neurofeedback. Let's look at some medication. Let's look at all the different solutions, because it just is your reality, And that's not a bad thing. As a matter of fact, I would tell you, being in recovery is the best thing that ever happened to me,
Yeah. And that's, I really have never spoken to somebody who wasn't successful in recovery that didn't feel that exact same way. I couldn't see it at the time, but now I can see that I was destroying my life and I was on my way to the grave.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And at the same time, I was, having the time of my life. I was great, and I'm like, why is everything such a failure? You know who it was a therapist that called me out. I started seeing a therapist with my dad in January of 1991. And this therapist finally looked at me and said, Kevin, every time you come in here, you start telling me about work and relationships and college, and they all have two things in common: you and alcohol.
Yeah.
And they're all disasters. And I'm like, good point. What are you trying to say?
Right. Yeah. And so I'm thinking about the fact that, we know that a lot of the times clients come in telling us they need something when they really have this other big thing that's going to come out eventually.
Right.
But I think that there are ways that we can sort of, dip our toe in the water and even kind of introduce that this is an acceptable thing for you to bring up. I'm a safe place. So when people are doing an intake of a new client, what are the things that you suggest, that like the screening questions you suggest, that help them think like, okay, I'm in the back of my mind, I'm going to remember that this is probably an issue that we're going to have to deal with at some point when they're ready to, discuss it or expose it or,
Sure.
whatever.
Sure. One of the things when I do intakes with families, right, is that I'm always like, so what's the history of alcoholism, addiction, and mental health in your family system? And what do they all say? Oh, there's none.
Right.
And the generational history of our family back to the Mayflower, zero. And I used to go after that, like, wow, wow, let me tell you. And now I'm like, oh, okay, cool. That's fascinating. Tell me.
Yeah.
And then like when I'll talk to a mom, and then I'm like, this really happened. Tell me about your parents and your family, where you grew up, da 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 da. And then 5 minutes in the conversation, she starts describing how, she was sexually assaulted by one of her dad's coworkers. And I'm like, okay, 5 minutes ago, you said, I had the most wonderful childhood. It was idyllic and perfect. And here we are. I said, and here's the thing I want you to understand. And this is really important. This is what we do in our society. We paint this picture of, oh my God, everything was great.
Mm-hmm.
The moment you say that to me, all my antennas go off. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. So what are we hiding? And I don't confront them. I just let them talk.
Mm-hmm.
Just let it go. So when you're interviewing, when you're doing a motivational interview or an intake with a client, hey, tell me about your history with drugs, alcohol, mental illness. I mean, don't call it substance abuse, because that's just like, whoa, and just be like, oh, how much do you drink? What's that like? And then when they start telling you, oh, this happened, or this situation, or I would, oh, okay, were you drinking? I'm just curious. And then how much were you drinking? Just gently ask those questions, and what you'll find is you'll start, what you want to do is help them see the repetitive pattern, right? Not the gotcha.
Right.
It's more like, huh, interesting. So it's interesting that you said you had a huge fight with your boyfriend, but you had been drinking wine all night. But then I also remember last time when we talked, you got into a huge fight with your boss when you guys were at happy hour.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to use that slow roll.
Connect the dots slowly. Yeah.
Because if you try to put the grab on them, they're just like, and nobody, because there's so much shame assigned to it, which is sad. It's really unfortunate.
Oh, absolutely. We're a society that pushes alcohol on people every day through media, images, all kinds of things. And then we punish them when they are not able to tolerate it the way we're able to tolerate that. But that's a weakness somehow, failing.
Absolutely. Now that, I've been sober 32 years, and I have the ability to sort of stand back and watch, and I'm just kind of like, huh.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. So, asking just sort of as your basic question, tell me about your alcohol use. Do you use any recreational drugs, any prescription medications? Tell me what that's like, sort of casually putting it in there. What about including the question about, have you had any legal problems? Is that helpful? I imagine that can be helpful in sort of like, sussing this out.
Yeah, it can be. So one of two things is going to happen. They're going to lie. And I get it. Nobody wants to be like, oh, well, yeah, I'm on my third DUI, or, my domestic violence charges, or fill in the blank. It's almost in the intake. I definitely would put it in the paperwork and just sort of let them fill it out themselves. But as far as like, trying to sort of slowly paint them into a corner, I don't bother. I'm like, I used to, but now it's just like, you're here seeing me. No, look, nobody comes to me because they're having a great day. Let's be honest. It's the beauty of people always like, so what do you do? And I'm like, oh, I'm a LMFT. I work with families that struggle with addiction. And they're like, oh, how's business? I'm like, well, the good news is business is great. And the bad news is business is great.
Right. Yeah.
And the other thing I always tell people is, everybody knows somebody that needs my help, because I swear to God, I can be on an airplane, I can be waiting for tacos at a taco stand. It doesn't matter. When people figure out who I am and what I do, they're like, oh man, my sister needs to talk to you, or oh God, I'm just like, that's how prevalent it is. So I have gotten to the point where and this is what I like to try to teach therapists is, sure, put that in your intake form, do a little motivational interviewing, but realize that it's going to take them a little time to feel comfortable with you. And then once they're comfortable with you, they're just going to, they're going to blab it all out. I always say people are like jigsaw puzzles. The more they talk, the more pieces you get, and then you put it together and you're like, oh, look at that. And what's the thread,
Mhm.
And so sometimes it just takes a little bit of time. And I mean, they're not going to walk in the door. I mean, hopefully they will, but they're not going to walk in
Mhm.
the door and be like, oh my God, I can't put down cocaine, or I'm, da 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 da. It's like, oh, okay. Tell me more about this. Tell me what happened. How did you get here? What did, et cetera. Oh, okay. By the way, were you drinking? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Like, and just sort of gently move the ball down the road.
Okay. Yeah, because when people are coming to see you, they know what you specialize in.
Yeah.
People coming to see me aren't necessarily ready to even address that or recognize that that's an issue in their life. So it can be a little tricky knowing how to navigate that. And for some reason, so years ago, somebody had said in a training, like you need to be asking clients about their legal history, because that can open up some doors for understanding. I've never been able to do it. And that could be a me thing. Maybe just feeling insecure that they're going to feel like I'm accusing them of something on that very first appointment. But that's just not, it just didn't sit well with me. And I can see if you're working with specific populations, that might be a really good question. But I think for the general therapist working with other populations, that's not going to feel good.
No, and it's just not. I don't think it's gonna create a barrier, right? Because
Mhm.
your client is immediately going to be on guard, like, oh shit, I can't tell her everything.
Mhm.
I can't do that. And what I always do is like, hey man, it's okay. Tell me. I mean, I literally had a family do this a while back where they were like, well, our daughter got a DUI, and I'd worked with them before. And I was like, oh gosh, so this is the second one. And they're like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then like the youngest child's like, no, she got one in high school. This is her third. And the mom's like, well, that one doesn't count. And I'm like, oh, okay. Okay. So,
God love mothers. We just do
uh,
everything we can to protect our babies, don't we?
and I do. I love the moms. I loved my mom. I loved her till the day she died. And she died from long-term prescription drug use, and
Mhm.
to the point where I was the guy that went to the ER and the ICU, and the doctor came out and he was just like, I don't know what to tell you. And I'm like, oh, it's okay. And he's like, really? Because your dad is in the waiting room bawling and saying, this is such a shock. It's such a surprise. And he's like, dude, I got to tell you, your mom's body is toxic. It's on every level of drug there's nothing I can do. I'm like, yeah, I know. And
Yeah. Yeah.
really, but the important part, and I love my parents and I'm sad. Don't get me wrong.
Of course. Yeah.
The important part of that story is that's the layer of denial that exists when it comes to substance abuse, mental health, and your typical family system, where it's like, oh, no, no. And my dad was the one getting the prescriptions.
Wow. Yeah.
And here's the thing. Okay, let me come all the way back to your question. I would automatically assume, I always assume, and then maybe it's because of my world that I live in, that when somebody comes to therapy and wants to help, that somewhere in the process, we're going to step over substance abuse somewhere. And I don't mean everybody's got a problem with drugs and alcohol. What I mean is that at some point, somewhere in the family history or the genealogy, somebody has struggled, and that struggle has impacted the family generationally.
Yeah.
It's altered people's behavior. They've become super codependent or attachment oriented or whatever you want to call it, and or they're really, they understand that they struggle with addictions and that sort of thing, so they've tried to figure out a way around that. I just assume that everybody has this in their tree somewhere. And I would tell you, I think that as a seasoned therapist, most therapists are like, yeah, eventually we're going to get to this. And I don't mean that your client's a drunk or a drug addict. I just mean they've had to deal with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's that shame piece as well. Much like when you ask a client, like, is there any mental health history in your family? Well, no one ever called it that, but my grandma was in bed all the time. But if you ask my parents, they would say she was depressed. She was just tired. And so I feel like hopefully, mental health is becoming more normalized, at least since the pandemic. Hopefully we are at least at the very beginning of the path with that, with addiction.
I think so. I mean, whenever occasionally I'll go lecture at graduate programs, and they'll be like, "Oh, so you're strictly private practice and cash, and how did that work out for you?" I'm like, "Well, you got to understand my niche. Addiction it's a constant in our society. It's not going to go away, and
Right.
families that are always going to want to know what to do. So I stumbled across a really interesting little niche that's just never going to leave. If anything, I mean, to be totally blunt with you, I'm still baffled that I don't have 15 people working for me and an entire building full of therapists, because that's how severe it is in our society.
Right.
But we're still not at a point where people are willing to be like, yeah, I know, I need your help, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like,
Right.
okay, that's cool. So I mean, I would love it if people came to me proactively, but the truth of the matter is most people come to me with, when the shit's hitting the fan.
Right, right. And so are there like with people with addiction, we often will see cycles before they're finally successful in recovery. And so I imagine you see those cycles with the families as well because they're experiencing that in real time.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things is they'll be like, well, something happened a week, a month, but they've toned it down and everything's okay. And I'm like, oh, that's just a bomb waiting to go off. Because if they truly struggle with addiction and truly struggle with the substance abuse stuff, there were times when I could keep it together, but there was just only a matter of time before you remember the old vaudeville act of the guy spinning the plates,
Yep.
would run around spinning the plates. That's what it's like being in active addiction. Okay. And because you're just doing the best you can to run around and keep everything and make the appearances look good and everything's okay. But you just know in the back of your mind that this shit's going to fall apart any moment now. And then so what I always tell people is, oh, okay, well, that's cool. He's not drinking, but why don't we make a proactive plan for what could happen in the future?
Yeah.
And then, oh my gosh, it happened. How did that happen? Okay. That's okay. So cycles, definitely, another one of my favorite phrases is when you're living with someone who struggles with addiction, every morning you wake up and the car from the roller coaster shows up at your front door. And you have a choice. You can get on or you can just let it go.
Yeah.
And it's super hard to let it go because that means you don't know what's going to happen. But you have a choice every day, because that's what it's like living with someone who struggles with addiction. It's like a roller coaster. Some days everything's groovy. Other days it's terrifying, And
then
so
you layer on that the secret keeping like you grew up with and the shame and having this whole, culture going on in your home that no one knows about.
yeah, and then the really funny part is you start finding out that the neighbors are dealing with
Of course. Yeah, it's just like people who say, I don't know about taking antidepressants. I'm like, pharmaceuticals are a multi-billion-dollar business for a reason. I guarantee you, people that are taking antidepressants, you just don't know they're taking them. And if you need it, you need it. So,
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
By the way, huge issue in the sober world is people that take antidepressants, SSRIs, benzos, because there's a lot of challenging. Well, are you really sober because you're taking medication? And it's like, yeah, I am. The question is, then it becomes, are you abusing the medication?
Right.
And now that's where one of the big pieces for sobriety and for the family is accountability and transparency.
Right.
But you're right on target with that assessment. 100%. No questions asked.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about, so you've got a course coming out. One of the things that I encourage people to do in our field, we're trained up to believe that we should all just help each other from the goodness of our hearts. But we need to accept that there are sometimes we need to pay somebody to supervise us, consult with us, teach us something. And so I'm going to say right up front, I'm sure you charge for your services. And as a therapist, if you need this guidance, you need to pay somebody for this in the best interest of your client. It's a cost of doing business. But tell us about the realm of the ways that you support therapists around this.
Sure. And I love the way you put that. And by the way, I don't take insurance. I'm a cash only guy. And
Mhm.
I spent 3 years in community mental health, and it taught me, oh no, never.
Yes.
Oh no. Well, okay, so let's start with, I have 2 books on Amazon. Oh look, here they are. Chronic Hope,
Chronic Hope. Okay.
Parenting the Addicted Child. Okay. It's
Okay.
only 100 pages, $10.
Great.
And then Chronic Hope, Families in Addiction. And this is more for like if somebody's not in high school,
Okay.
also $10.
Good
And then,
entry point for working with you and getting their feet wet. Yep.
yeah, the course that I offer for therapists right now is $297. It's about 3 hours long.
Hmm.
It does come, it's like I said, it's 3 hours long. It comes with a workbook, which is basically sort of a rehashing of the books and stuff of how to go through the process. And I literally just reviewed it again yesterday, and I was like, no, this is really good. This is really valuable information. I think this is the kind of stuff that therapists who don't engage with addiction at all would be like, oh, okay. Like I talk about the difference between hard users, social users, and addicts, and that sort of thing. And then I do consultation. Consultation's $250 an hour, and it's generally we can get through things really quickly. I also offer, I have a podcast channel on Apple, the Chronic Hope Institute. I have a YouTube channel, the Chronic Hope Institute. I have an Instagram page, Kevin W. Petersen, where I am constantly pushing stuff out and talking about and then I have a TikTok called the Family Addiction Coach, where I'm constantly giving stuff away for free.
Lots of free content out there people can absorb. And if they're not getting what they need, then they can dig deeper with you.
Email me, I'm happy to set something up. I love doing trainings. I love, my passion is educating people on this information and helping them. And so they can turn around and help their clients and help their people. So yeah, the entrance is $10. The education is $300 or $297. And then for actually working with clients, I offer 3 different levels on the coaching, so it's $500 for just sort of the do-it-yourself package, the online and the books, et cetera, et cetera. And then $1,500 for all the online education books and workbook, and then 4 sessions with me. And then $2,500 is 8 sessions. And I'm totally open to splitting those into half-hour sessions and whatever the necessity is, But yeah, that's kind of how I roll. And then, I still have an office in Denver where we offer therapy. And here in Florida, I'm licensed in Florida as well. And I do some therapy here as well. But for the therapist that's interested in learning more about families that struggle with addiction, go to my website, chronichope.us. You'll see a thing that says professionals. Click on that and you'll see the class. Yeah.
Great. And I'm just going to throw in there, because this comes up when people are learning about my consultation groups, because this is a service that you're providing to a therapist, not as a supervisor, then it does not matter where they are located and you're located. And sometimes people get very confused about that. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that you're literally a resource for anyone, no matter where they are.
And on that same note, thank you very much. 100% thank you. The other note is, the next question is, do I get CEUs for this? And I'm like, look, I love you that you asked that question. Every state has a different set of rules.
Yes.
And it's the stupidest thing I've ever seen in my entire life. I would love to give you CEUs, but I would go broke getting regulated in 50 states. Yeah. And here's the dumb part about it all. In Florida, when I renewed my license just this last year, I was like, oh, I have all these CEU courses that I attended, blah, 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 blah. They're like, yeah, none of those count. And I was like, what? They're like, no, you have to buy the $100 CEU package from our official provider and take those classes only. Those are the only ones that count. Like, this is a racket.
Wow. Yes. Wow. I did not know that about Florida. That's really useful to know. And plus, most people have no idea how strenuous and frustrating it is to try and become a CEU provider. Oh. And so most of us are like, nope, not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah. So I definitely do consultation, and I'm open to consultation groups. I love doing that stuff. And then there are no CEUs involved in this. If at some point there is some sort of national compact where I can do one application and turn in all my research and all my work, I would love to do that, But
Yeah.
until then, the answer is no. And you know, I also, like you said, here's the thing. My sales pitch is, how many classes did you take on addiction? 0. How many classes did you take on families and addiction? 0. I said, how often is it in your office? Every day. Right.
Yep.
Let me help you with that.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
let me help
Right.
you. So.
Yep, absolutely. Okay. Well, you've already shared a couple with us, but I'm going to give you a chance to throw out any more that you have. If you have a favorite phrase or analogy you like to use with clients, hit us with some more.
I do. Here's my absolute favorite. You're going to love this one. Healthy families come from healthy individuals. Healthy individuals work on their shit. Everybody has shit. And my wife says, that's going to be the front of the t-shirt. Okay. And on the back, it's going to say, of course, we're going to talk about your childhood. You know,
I love that so much. You're right. I do love that.
It's like, oh God, where did you think this came from? You know?
Yes.
So
yes.
but my whole point is that, you know, the number one thing you can do to help your loved one is to help yourself.
Right.
Because nothing terrifies an addict or an alcoholic more than the family or their loved ones saying, you know, we love you. We're just not going to participate in this bullshit anymore. And
Yeah.
they know, they're like, uh-oh, you know.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important message, because I think a lot of people feel like it's this, you know, the tough love, all or nothing. I'm either, you know, tolerating you and your behavior, or I've cut you off completely and you're on your own. And it doesn't, you know, it's not a duality. There's a different way you can go about this, more effective, obviously, way to go about this.
Much more so. And then the other thing too is that everybody thinks that, oh, we got to go straight to an intervention. We got to drop the nuclear bomb. I'm like, no. Slow down.
Mm-hmm.
Let's try changing the family system and see how that flows, and give it a chance. And again, if they're shooting heroin and they have needles in their arm and they're doing death-defying stuff, no, we're going to go straight to intervention, you know.
Right.
But for the most part, if it's alcohol or marijuana or some basic stuff, let's try this path. But it's more a path of changing the family system than it is changing the individual, you know.
Sure. Yeah. And so you kind of liken that to working with the client to see if you can make some behavioral changes to treat their depression before you start shoving an antidepressant down their throat. Right.
I mean, it's the pillars, right? Okay. Exercise, nutrition, meditation, therapy,
Yep.
You know, community. Yep. Have we tried everything? You know?
Right. Absolutely. Well, Kevin, I so appreciate having you on today. This has been a great conversation. I think it's something that more of us need to learn about, because obviously there's deficiency there in our trainings. So you have shared with me, you've shared your book and that you have a course. I'm going to be putting that information in the show notes so people can find you and find that. And so it'll be very easy. For everyone listening, there are new episodes of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast released every Thursday on all major platforms. Please remember, our work is hard, but it doesn't have to be lonely.
Amen.
Thank you so much for listening to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. For show notes, links, and downloads, head over to colleaguedownthehall.com, where you'll be able to learn more about getting the clinical support you need and resources to help you work in a supported, sustainable way. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share with your therapy friends and colleagues. Subscribe to the podcast, and if you love this episode, please leave a review.